Hello. In this video I would like to talk about Kant and the sort of general framework of Kant's moral philosophy, what is often referred to as deontology or duty-based ethics. Alright, so Kant starts off with, if you read that first part of the reading, and Kant starts off with the idea that some things are good for other things. They have what we might call instrumental value, and some things are good just simply in themselves. Now, whatever that sort of means, and we're not going to necessarily get into that aspect of this, but whatever that means, reason for Kant is the one thing that is quite literally good for nothing. Now, it's not to say reason doesn't help us, or it's not to say there is no practical use to reason. Certainly there is. But when taken by itself, Kant seems to think that reason is alone, by itself, good. Nothing makes it good, and it's not good because of what it does. It's not good because of its consequences. It's just sort of good. We're going to accept that, and we'll just sort of go along. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but it's certainly Kant's position, and we can take it from there. So we have reason, and then everything else Kant does focuses around this notion of reason. So with that in mind, we talk about the will, or Kant will talk about the will. And what the will is, and if you read closely, there's some passages in there, one in particular that sort of indicates this, but for Kant, the will seems to be something like the basic capacity to act. In this sense, then things like cats and dogs, as well as humans and so on, have a will. It's the basic capacity to act. But of course the will must be governed, because as we all know, certainly as Kant knew, the will can do things, sometimes good and sometimes bad. And so what we want, presumably, is a good will. And the good will is going to be the will that's directed by reason, and that's going to mean something very specific that we'll get to in a moment. So one must have the basic capacity to act. And so we can say, first, one must have a will. But the will alone isn't going to suffice. One must have a will, but that will must be free. The will must not be compelled. The will must not be forced into anything. In other words, the will must be, the will must be autonomous. And so you have two words, two Greek words, auto, of course, meaning of the self, and then this other word, nomos, which derives from the Greek meaning law or governing, legislation, that sort of thing. And so the word autonomous means, quite literally, and certainly for Kant, self-governing. One must have a will, and one must be the type of creature that is self-governing. Again, we'll explore that in just a little bit. So what does this mean? Or let's I guess maybe let's dig into this a little bit deeper. So what does it mean to be self-legislating, governing oneself? It means one must not be governed by something else. Passions, emotions, somebody else forcing you, instinct, that sort of thing. Which leaves really only one other thing left. And so in order to be autonomous, one must also be reasonable. One must be reasonable. Now this means something pretty specific for Kant. And you should have read this, we should have studied this. To be reasonable, in part, means to avoid contradictions. It means lots of things. It means be able to conceive of ideas and concepts and so on. But it also means to avoid contradictions. And of course, a contradiction is the assertion and denial of the exact same proposition at the same time. And as we talked about, as you should have read about and so on, contradictions are always false. So for Kant, then, to accept a contradiction is the most supremely irrational thing one can do. And so if one acts on a contradiction, I'll get to that in a second, then one's action is immoral. But let's sort of fill that out a little bit. One more step here. And in maintaining reason, Kant says that we have a duty to reason. One must be dutiful. So these are four key components of Kant's moral philosophy. You must have a will. The will must be autonomous, must be free. And what that means is the will must be governed by reason and reason alone. And then one has an absolute duty to reason. Okay, let's shift here and talk about sort of the steps that Kant is conceiving of here. There's sort of a four-step process to asking whether a particular action is moral or immoral. Now, we're not going to refer to consequences. Kant does not want to refer to the consequences of an action. And his sort of basic reasoning is, we have no control over certain actions. So he's going to want to limit the judgment of what's moral or immoral solely to actions that we can control. And this has to do with this idea of being reasonable. Reasonable people can control certain actions and not others. And so we can't look to the action itself and the consequences. We have to look to the rule that's governing the action and inquire whether there's a contradiction in it. Now, Kant seems to think we obey rules when we perform an action. When you go to the grocery store to buy milk, the rule you're following is when you're out of milk and you want some, then you go to the store. You might not think in terms like that, but it seems to be what we're doing, or whether you put gas in your car or something like that. You seem to be following these rules. When I need gas, then I go get it. He seems to think we're doing the same thing for all of our actions. So our first step here, Kant wants us to find the maxim of our action. Now, a maxim is just a fancy way of saying rule. That's all it is. So find the maxim of your action. What rule are you following when you perform a certain action? All right. So find your personal maxim. The second thing is, once you've found that maxim, then universalize it. So let's sort of limit this now to sort of the moral realm. And so if I say, like, murder, for example, then I find my maxim. My maxim when I murder is something like, I should murder when it's convenient for me to do so, something like that, right? Then universalize it, and the I becomes we. So my personal maxim is, I should murder when it's convenient, or I should murder when I want to get revenge on someone. Universalize that. We should murder when we want revenge, or when we want to get revenge on somebody, or something like that. So the I essentially just becomes we. So find my personal maxim, find my universal maxim, Then the third step is to take a step back and to analyze the concept of the action. Analyze the concept of the action. What's involved in the action? What are the conditions of the action? So what does it mean to murder? Well, we can put some time into this. I only have a short amount of time, so it becomes something like to take someone's life against their will, to take someone's life against their will, to kill someone without their permission. These are sort of key components, right? Because if it's just to kill, if that's what we mean by murder, is to kill, then if I chop down the tree, then I'm presumably murdering the tree. Or if I accidentally hit someone with my car, let's say, then I have murdered them. And before you say, well, yeah, we need to think about what that says about what we mean when we say murder. If murder is simply killing, then any act of killing is in fact murder. But clearly we don't want to say things like that. That means anybody who killed for any reason would be in jail for murder. Plus, this would trivialize the cases in which someone is murdered against their will, because all acts of killing would be murder. So presumably that's not what we want. Murder is very specific. It's killing without permission, which also means that there must be creatures able to give permission or not grant permission in order for there to be murder. Okay, so this is going to be important here in just a second. But these are the sort of basic steps. This is sort of a way of analyzing the concept. What's involved in murder, or let's say rape, or donating to charity, or rescuing somebody from a burning building, and so on. So part of what we have to do is to analyze the concept. And then the next step is, once we have our personal universal maxim, personal and universal maxim, and once we've analyzed the concept, then the next step is to ask if there's a contradiction between 2 and 3. 2 and 3. So is there a contradiction between the universal concept of the action and the universal maxim itself? So in this case of murder that we're talking about, on the one hand, what it means to murder is to take the life of someone without their permission. A rational person without their permission. But we notice the universal maxim says you should murder, say when it's convenient, which seems to be giving you permission. And so on the one hand, you are given permission to murder, because that's what the universal maxim does. It's a maxim that is as if it were a law of nature, that every rational creature would abide by. And so it says you should. So it's kind of like giving you permission. Whereas the concept of the action involves the denial of the permission. So for Kant, this is a contradiction. And since contradictions are always false, to accept a contradiction is to willingly accept something that one knows to be false, which is a supreme act of irrationality. And hence the action is immoral, not because of harm, not because of fear, not because of what it does to society, but simply because it's a contradiction. Murder is wrong because it is irrational. So a slightly different spin on sort of traditional morality. What's wrong is what's unreasonable. Now there's clear practical implications to this as well. Murder is very impractical. Rape is very impractical. And so on. Most of sort of the bad, quote-unquote bad things that we do would seemingly be impractical. But for Kant, it's not whether or not they're actually practical or not. I mean, he does go on to say things like, No one would want to live in a world in which we didn't give to charity. No one would want to live in a world in which people murdered each other. So there's a practical side to this. But ultimately, donating to charity is okay because the maxim is in fact universalizable. Right? So if we go back to the case of murder again, the maxim isn't universalizable. You can't actually universalize the action because in a world where everyone were given permission to murder, the very definition of what it means to murder would be self-undermined because everyone would have permission to murder. And so the maxim can't be universalized. It can't be universalized because it's a contradiction. And again, contradictions are always false. To accept a false claim or to act on an action whose maxim is a contradiction is to be unreasonable. And for Kant, to be unreasonable is to lose the very possibility of morality. Okay, that's Kant in a nutshell. There's a little bit more to it, but you'll get that through the readings and maybe through the notes, and hopefully I'll say a few things in discussion as well. But one of the problems we find with Kant is precisely this notion of rationality. And Kant seems to be a little too strict when it comes to this, asking people to always be rational. And so, I mean, to always look for the analyzation of the concept, to always be able to identify our maxims and so on, and to be able to find out if there's a contradiction. There's a sense in which this is too much. As reasonable as it is, it's too much to do for every single action. As if there were some sort of rule book that we could look at and say, no, this is immoral because it's a contradiction and so on. So he seems to be too strict when it comes to reasoning. Another reason to say he's too strict is because by limiting morality to merely whether a maxim is involved in a contradiction or not, is to ignore the actual practical business of the world. And so we want to take into account consequences of actions. We want to say, well, this action, helps this, or this action is bad because it does this, and because of its effects in the world. We are physical creatures, and we do bump into each other and so on. And so by strictly limiting morality to reason, Kant's ignoring the more practical aspect of our lives. So maybe it's not all just about practicality, but certainly it's not just about reason as well. Now, a further problem with this sort of idea of this being too strict is that if someone is unreasonable, say like children or the mentally infirmed, if you will, let's say the mentally handicapped, shouldn't have said infirmed, or the geriatric, the extremely old, who maybe can't reason as well, then they seemingly lose the ability to be sort of moral beings. Now, maybe it doesn't mean that they don't deserve moral recognition. They're certainly not seen as moral agents. And again, this seems to be sort of too strict for us. So, in large, we kind of realize that, as interesting as it is, Kant's idea on morality might not be sort of all there is to morality. But the lesson we can learn, of course, is that, and one of the really neat things about Kant is he does show us sort of how important reason is to moral decision making. So it's not all there is, certainly. But it is incredibly important to be reasonable and to begin to avoid contradictions and to be able to analyze our concepts. So it's not all there is, but Kant's philosophy really goes a long way to showing just how important reason is. And it might be doubtful how moral we could be if we weren't reasonable. So it very well might be the types of creatures we are, these rational beings, that inform us about what is moral and what's immoral. So reason might actually have quite a bit to do with morality, but maybe not as much as Kant would have us think. Okay, I hope this helps. There's some notes. Feel free to look online. As always, my door's open. You can always make an appointment, walk in if I'm here, and so on. Till next time, bye.